Hey guys, welcome back. In my last couple of videos, I was using the Launch Torque 5 as a multimeter, lab scope, and a scanner. Today, I'm going to show you just the lab scope function. If you're not familiar with a lab scope and what a lab scope does, I'm going to go over that briefly here as well. So in the X431 app, if we scroll over, there is a button for the scope box 2. We're going to click on that button. We are using a 2-channel scope. In my previous videos, I navigated to this scope module from the home screen. And I did that because I was running the scanner in one tab and the scope in another. So there's multiple ways to navigate to the scope. Now what a scope does is it's going to display voltage over time. So depending on whatever we connect to using our test leads, we're going to see a picture of that on the scan tool. And it's going to be displayed, if it was a constant voltage, like say we hook it up to the battery, the car's not running, it's just going to show us, 12 to 12.8 volts, and it's just going to be a flat line, assuming we have some voltage in the battery. It's not until we have some sort of activity on that line that we actually see some sort of waveform. With a scope, we can adjust how much time we see on the screen and how much height we see on the screen. So depending on what our measurement is, if we're measuring really, really small stuff like a ground wire, we may want to see just the millivolts. We don't want to see, 20 volts or anything like that. If we're measuring something that's on the main battery system that has a 12-volt supply, we're probably going to want to see 20 volts on the screen just so we can get a clear picture in case we have any spikes that jump above that. Now, in case I have anyone that's wanting to do ignition testing with this scope, I did look at the spec sheet. This scope has a 40-volt input. So if we're going to do ignition coil testing for ignition coil primary, the older 2-wire coils and some 3-wire coils, or injectors or solenoids, then we are going to have to add an attenuator on these lines that's going to reduce our signal and protect our scope, because a lot of those signals will jump up to 100, 200, even 400 volts depending on what it is. But today we're going to do something that's a little more common and doesn't require an attenuator, and that is checking the camshaft position sensor on a vehicle. I have the Shop Toyota Highlander here. This is a 3-wire Hall effect sensor, and meaning it's going to be a digital output. And I'm not sure on this one if we have a 5-volt sensor or a 12-volt sensor. More than likely, it's going to be a 5-volt sensor. Most vehicles use that, which means our signal coming out of that is just going to be a 0 to 5-volt square wave. So let's go through the process of connecting the scope up to the sensor to get a picture that we can interpret and see how changing our time base and our scaling will change what we can see on the screen. So on top of the lab scope, we have 2 channels. I'm going to connect to channel 1. And this is another set of leads I have. They already had the alligator clip and the piercing probe installed on it, so I just grabbed this set. The kit does come with a set of test leads, and it also comes with a couple of alligator clips, some back probe needles, and then some test leads for the multimeter side as well. So now that I'm connected, we're still not going to see this scope on our tablet here until we power it on. I am connected via USB. If you want to connect wirelessly, you can do that as well. You just have to make sure to set that up ahead of time. There is an additional step to connect this wirelessly. But I'm going to hold the power button that's on the top of the unit. And the lights are going to light up here, indicating that it powered on. So now that we're connected, we see a waveform on the screen. Now, it's kind of hard to see where that waveform's at. It's kind of hovering around 172 millivolt line. What we can do on the scan tool is we can move our voltage measurement that's on the left-hand side. We can move that up and down, depending on how tall our waveform is. And as I move that, you can see that the screen refreshes itself to acknowledge that new position. So I kind of like to move those lines to where my common voltage indicators like 1 volt, 2 volt, 3 volt line up with one of the division markers that are on the screen. We have kind of this grid pattern on the screen. Those are our divisions. So to make fine adjustments, I can hit the up and down arrows in the bottom left until I get that close to lined up. Let me see here. Right there looks perfect. So I have one line that is 0 millivolts. Next one is 2 volts, 4 volts, 6 volts. So if you're wondering what my scaling is, if we look over in the top right of this screen where it says channel 1, I have channel 1 is the only channel that's activated right now, and it says 2 volts. That means I have 2 volts for each one of those divisions going up and down, which if there's 10 divisions on the screen, I have a total of 20 volts displayed. Now, say I was hooked up to channel 2 and I don't need channel 1, I can just tap this channel 1 button, tap it twice, it shuts off, we'll turn on channel 2. Channel 2 was already set up for 1 volt per division. That's whatever I used it last, it was set up for 1 volt. So we can use channel 1 or channel 2. Now, although we're not going to be using it in this demonstration here, if we were using an attenuator, more than likely we're going to use a 10 times attenuator, and it's going to reduce our signal level by 10 times. So if we were testing an ignition coil and the inductive kick of that ignition coil was jumping up to 300 volts, that quick spike, if we had a 10x attenuator on there, it would only be 30 volts on the wire. In order to get the scanner or the scope to display that properly, we need to tell it that we're using an attenuator. So if I tap on the channel 1 button, it has an option for the 1x or the 10x. So 1x is no attenuator, it's going to be 1 times our signal. 10x is 10 times our signal. So we'll leave it on 1x for today. You can invert the signal on this lab scope. It calls it reversed. So if we click that button, any positive voltage will be shown as negative voltage. This is really handy if you're using an amp clamp and you have it hooked around a wire and it's really hard to get in there and your waveform's displayed upside down. Instead of undoing that and reconnecting it, you can just hit that reverse button. It's going to flip that waveform upside down. Now, the other thing I'll briefly mention here is our coupling mode. One of the best explanations I've heard from this was from a class I took from Bryn Klein on the Snap-on scope. And he talks about DC and AC, and he uses an analogy with the ocean, or a reference with the ocean. DC is going to show us from the depths of the ocean all the way to the top. So we're going to see the entire depth of the ocean. And if we want to look at the waves on top of the ocean, it's really, really difficult. It's fairly smooth if we're looking at the entire ocean. If we switch over to AC, we completely remove the depth of the ocean. We're looking at just the waves on top. And those waves, if we're sitting at eye level with the waves, those waves are really big. So most of our testing, we're going to be on DC because we want to see our potential from 0 up. But there's certain things where we will switch over to AC. And in the future, I'll demonstrate some of those for you. So with those settings set, let's go ahead and connect to our camshaft sensor. Now, this is a 3-wire sensor. I did not pull a wiring diagram, and I'm actually just going to guess at which wire is which. If we get it wrong, we'll connect to another wire. We're not going to hurt anything by connecting to the wrong wire. We're going to have a ground. We're going to have a voltage source, which is probably going to be 5 volts, and we're going to have a signal wire. So if we see nothing at all, more than likely we're on the ground or we have a bad connection. If we see a solid 5 volts, we're on our power supply. If we see a square wave pattern, then we got the right wire and we're on the signal wire. I'm going to connect the ground of my scope to a good ground. On this one, I'm just going to connect to the valve cover. You can connect to the battery. Sometimes you get less noise if you're connected at the battery. But on this vehicle, it has a noise capacitor for the ignition coils. So hopefully we won't have too much noise anyways. And now I'm going to go ahead and start up the vehicle and see what kind of waveform we get. If we don't like what we see, we can make some adjustments. Now, some people like to stick to a specific amount of time and a specific amount of voltage on the screen. I like to just hook it up, see where I'm at, make adjustments while the waveform's on the screen to see if I like the picture I'm seeing. I don't find that one number is a perfect number. Sometimes if I'm looking for just a glitch or a dropout or a sensor to fail, I'll put a lot of time on the screen so I can see when that happens. If I'm wanting to look and see if maybe my timing's off a little bit and I'm comparing one sensor to another, I'll zoom in a little bit more on that waveform. So let's go ahead and start the car. So it looks like we do have 5 volts. Sorry for the noise of the vehicle. I'm going to actually zoom in on that a little bit because I want to see a little more detail. I don't need to see what's above 5 volts. So if I hit this, this button all the way on the top right, we can see that it shows a tall waveform and a short waveform. I want to make our waveform taller and get rid of that empty space. So I'm going to hit the taller button, and there we go. So now we have a total of 10 volts, 1 volt per division. We have 10 divisions, so 10 volts on the screen. And that is the wire I picked, is our 5-volt reference wire. Now we do see a little bit of noise on there and we don't see a signal. So I'm gonna move to the next wire, and either I picked our ground wire or I have a bad connection because I don't have a signal here. So I'm gonna try the next wire and see what I get. So third time's the charm. Now we have our signal wire. Now I can't really see what's going on here. The information is just kind of whizzing by the screen. Now this is recording the information to the internal buffer. So in the bottom right, there's a button that says run. Currently we are running. If I tap that, it'll go to stop and it'll stop our waveform. If we wanted to, we can go ahead and shut the vehicle off and we can take a minute to analyze this waveform. Now, when you are zoomed out quite a ways and you stop the waveform, you can zoom in and get a little better detail on that waveform, but you can only go so far before the waveform gets kind of blurry. You know, the resolution isn't there depending on how far you're zooming in. To zoom in, down at the bottom, we see a button that looks like it has multiple waveforms, multiple square waves, or just a single square wave. If we want to see multiple, it's going to zoom out so we can see more of the forest, I would say. If we want to see just a single tree, we're going to hit that button next to it and it's going to zoom us in a little bit. And we can see our waveform right there. Now, if we had another signal to compare it to, another cam sensor or crank sensor, sometimes you want to zoom in to see exactly where they're lining up. Now I'm going to go ahead and start the vehicle again, and we're going to make those adjustments that I just made while it's running, and I'll show you what that looks like. So to start the scope, we're going to hit the stop button because our waveform was stopped and now it is running. So now at the bottom it says 20 milliseconds. So we have 20 milliseconds per division. We have 10 divisions going time-wise, and that means that we have 200 milliseconds on our screen. If we want to see more of the waveform, we can zoom out to 100 milliseconds times 10 is 1,000 milliseconds, and we can go even more. So here's 5 seconds of time on the screen. Now there are some things that we lose the more time we add. At some point, I believe we lose our triggering function, which I'm probably beyond that point now. I no longer see my trigger on the screen. And if you're not sure what a trigger is a way for us to line up our waveform easily on the screen. So let me zoom in to where our trigger is activated, and I'll show you how to do that. So it looks like under 100 milliseconds, we can activate our trigger. So up at the top, it shows the trigger and it says 3.69 volts. And then it has a little dashed line that's kind of going up. That means that is a rising edge trigger. Once our waveform rises above that 3.69 volts, it's going to activate that trigger and it's going to line the waveform up with that. Now, seeing that this is a fairly fast moving square wave, we're going to have a lot of lines that are going to pass that voltage mark. But let's go ahead and activate this anyways. Okay, I was mistaken. Anything under 50 milliseconds is where we can activate all of our trigger functions. So I just had to change my time scale a little bit. Over on the right, we see an extra bar that popped up on the screen that says level. We can slide that bar up and down to decide where we want our trigger to activate. If I put it up here, it's really not going to do anything because none of my voltage spikes are going above that point. If we drop it down right here, almost every single one of these square waves is going to pass that mark. Now we can also see there's a little diamond that sticks down from the top, and it's right in the center of our graph at the top, and that is this point in time when our trigger is activated. So if I move that trigger, which my big fingers, it takes a second to grab it, then I can line it up with, over on the left-hand side of the screen. It's my preferred method to put my trigger marker further to the left. Some people like to put it on the right. If I'm looking for a signal to drop out or fail, say a power supply to a fuel pump, I would put that trigger, more towards the right, maybe 2/3 of the way. So I have voltage on the left, and then, it'll fill my screen up, and then once it drops down, it'll activate that trigger. So it just kind of keeps stuff lined up and square for us. We have a couple of options to save the waveform once it passes that trigger point. So down at the bottom right, we see auto or single trigger. If I hit single trigger, as soon as that waveform crosses that point, which this is the rising edge, then it's gonna stop the waveform. So it stopped it already because it immediately went above that voltage. It rose through that voltage. And then we can analyze that waveform. That is really handy for intermittent dropouts because you can set it to where if the voltage drops off or the voltage rises, we can set that trigger, we can come back and analyze that waveform. So that's where I like the single trigger, is when I'm looking for dropouts or glitches as well. Now there are a few other options for the triggering. I haven't gone through all of these yet, but there's a, you can pick a level, a rise, a drop, or a close. So rise, drop, I would call that a falling trigger. So those are the two most common, depending on if the voltage is going up or the voltage is coming down when you want it to cross that point and start closing. And I'm not sure what close is unless that just turns it off, which that may be what it does, because our little voltage indicator up by the trigger goes away. But we'll just leave it on rising edge. Now I'm gonna stop this waveform and shut off the vehicle so there's a little less noise. Now that we have a waveform on the screen, we may want to take some measurements. Yeah, we can glance over to the left-hand side of the screen and say, okay, we're about 4.3 volts and we're starting about 0.8 volts. But if we wanted to make sure that this sensor was working within spec, we could look at the service information, see what that range is supposed to be, and we can do some measurements. So at the bottom of the screen, the third button in from the left has a cursor with an equal sign. Well, it's not actually an equal sign, it's a horizontal cursor. So if we push that button, we get two cursors up on the screen, and it's gonna measure the voltage between those two cursors. So we have to set those cursors to where we want to measure from. Now we can see a little diamond on that bottom line over on the right-hand side. I'm gonna grab that with my thumb. I'm gonna pull this line up to the bottom of this waveform. And then the upper line has the diamond on the left. There we go. So then it's in kind of fine print up on the top right, but our Y measurement number 1 is at 4.01 volts. Our number 2 measurement is at 810 millivolts. And our delta between those, our total amplitude of our waveform, is 3.2 volts. So if we were using this to measure a 2-wire cam sensor, a variable reluctance cam sensor, those have a AC voltage that come out of them, and the voltage gets higher with engine speed. And a lot of times, if your amplitude is a little too low, those won't start. So a lot of times in service information, it'll say, crank over the vehicle, you should have this much voltage while cranking at this engine speed. So you can put these cursors on there and measure to see how much your voltage is. If we want to turn those cursors off, we just tap the button again at the bottom. And then the other one right next to it is cursors that are 2 vertical lines. So we're going to put 2 vertical cursors and we're going to measure how much time is between them. So if we were looking at this cam sensor and we want to see, well, you know, how long is it taking, how many milliseconds is it taking for this camshaft to rotate? Or if we're comparing this signal to another signal, we can look at how many milliseconds delayed is the signal. So let's go ahead and turn that on. And we see the 2 little buttons on our lines. So I'm going to line this up with that short pulse, and then I'll line this up with this short pulse. Now I don't really know if this is a full rotation of the camshaft. I'm thinking it is because it looks like a repeating pattern of short, long, medium on the screen. That's the width of the trigger wheel inside the engine. And we have some information on the screen. Our position number 1 is at 2.3 milliseconds. Position number 2 is at 158 milliseconds. Our distance between them, actually that first one was a negative, but our distance between them is 161 milliseconds. And then it's also going to give us our frequency, which is 6.1 or 6.2 hertz. So if we were looking at a duty cycle and we needed to know what the hertz or the frequency of a signal was, we can do that here. Now, if we have something on the screen that we want to save, we have a couple of options for that as well. At the bottom of the screen, all the way at the bottom on the Android buttons, the second one from the right looks like a little portrait, some mountains with the sun or a moon. If we click that, it'll take a screenshot. It'll save that screenshot for us. If we want to save this waveform so we can zoom in on it later, there's a button at the bottom that says quickly save. It'll save it with a default name into their folder on the tablet. If we want to name it, we'll go up to the top and we'll hit menu. We'll go to save, and we can actually enter our own file name. And we have an option of saving it as a waveform or a comma separated value. So if we wanted to look at all these data PIDs in Excel, then you could, or if you have another waveform viewer that can open up CSV files, you can do that. Let's go ahead and save it. Tap out of there. And I think that's basically it for the basics of the LabScope. I know that seemed kind of complicated, but I think for the most part, if you can connect to the vehicle and start measuring certain sensors and readings, then you'll get an idea of how this works. Just remember, if you're using this on a ignition coil that has 3 wires or 2 wires, make sure that it's not going to have a high voltage because you don't want to damage the scope unit. If you're using it on injectors, we need to have an attenuator as well. And solenoids like VVT solenoids or purge solenoids, vent solenoids, we need to have that attenuator on there. So when we start examining those types of solenoids and sensors and components, then we need to install the attenuator on our line. Change our setting to 10x so it'll boost our signal back up because the attenuator is going to shrink it. And that way we can still keep our scope safe while measuring all the components on the engine. So if you guys have any questions or comments on the Launch Torque 5 with the LabScope, then put those down below. I'll try to get back to you as quick as I can. If it's something I didn't cover in this video or one of my other videos, then I'll try to make a point to cover that in a future video. I'm still learning the tool, so as I learn new tips and tricks, I'll share those with you guys. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more videos like this, subscribe, click the bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.